Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is Friday, February 7th. Following the news these days is like drinking from a fire hose. This week has been no different, so let's go to it. On Tuesday, President Trump shook the world by announcing that the United States would take over Gaza and build a Riviera on the Mediterranean. On Wednesday, his aides went on TV and to Capitol Hill to try to walk it back. But then on Thursday, Trump doubled down. Israel will turn over Gaza to the United States once the fighting is over. You can't make this up. One U.S. agency that would be expected to help reconstruct Gaza is the U.S. Agency for International Development. But this week, Elon Musk's purge of the federal government extended to USAID, with more than 10,000 workers told to go home, the agency's doors locked, and its website going dark. USAID today is effectively no more. And even as Trump extended his manifest destiny to the Middle East, he was reigniting a trade war not only with America's biggest adversary, but also with its two immediate neighbors. On Tuesday, 10% tariffs went into effect on Chinese imports, and the following series of phone calls with leaders of Mexico and Canada, Trump did pull back on his threat to impose 25% tariffs on imports from their countries, but only for 30 days. Here to help us sort out and make sense of this week's events are three reporters who are covering these stories closely. Nahal Toosi is Senior Foreign Affairs Correspondent for Politico. David Luhnow is London Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. And Peter Spiegel is U.S. Editor of the Financial Times and soon Managing Editor of the Washington Post. Peter, congrats. That's a big move.
Thank you, Ivo.
And we want to keep you involved on World Review, but you'll know even more when you're at the Post managing their newsroom. David, let's start with you. Gaza. We thought we were going to talk about, are we going to get phase 2 and phase 3 of the ceasefire agreement? We recall that agreement is still in effect and hostages are still supposed to be released and the fighting is supposed to be ending. But now we're talking about something else. Beachfront property in Gaza. All of a sudden, this strip in which 2 million people are still living is being seen as a real estate development project. David, what are we to make of the events of this week, and where do you think this is heading?
Well, that is anybody's guess. I mean, I think you overpromised at the top of the show that we would make sense of this, because I think it's, frankly, it's very difficult to make sense of. We see this is the probably the biggest example of Trump's outside of the box thinking. It's been coming pretty thick and fast recently. There was his pledge to try to buy Greenland, which was a pretty big one. Canada becoming the 51st state. The U.S. taking over the Panama Canal again, and now, of course, the U.S. taking over Gaza. All of this sort of feels, along with his tariffs, like something from sort of the 19th century, the age of sort of expansion and mercantilism. And as you say, it sort of reflects Trump's roots as a real estate guy. He's not wrong that Gaza is prime real estate and could become something really thriving. But when you try to take this idea, when you try to take any of these ideas and bring them down to a practical level, things get complicated pretty quickly. In the case of Gaza, of course, what does it mean to move 2 million people? What if they don't want to go? How do you force them to move? Who is going to force them to move? This will be U.S. boots on the ground, pointing guns at Palestinians to get them out of their homes. That's probably not a look that the United States or any country would want to have. And then where would they go? Who would take them in? He mentioned Egypt as one possible place. Egypt has long resisted taking in Palestinians, so that doesn't seem very likely. who would pay this money to be rebuilt? Would the Palestinians then come back? Would many of them stay abroad? What happens to Hamas? Would American soldiers come in and clear out the remnants of Hamas? Would they be fighting Hamas? So, what it does is sort of moves the parameters of the discussion. I mean, moving Palestinians en masse is an idea that not even the Israeli far right has really proposed. I mean, far right politicians like Itamar Ben-Gvir had proposed some voluntary resettlement of Palestinians, but no one had really suggested wholesale moving people out. So it does introduce ideas that were taboo. Maybe the idea is to sort of broaden the discussion so much that sort of anything's on the table as Israel and the U.S. and the region try to look at what comes next as part of sort of the search for a grand bargain for peace in the Middle East. It also may, obfuscate other issues that were perhaps more real during Netanyahu's visit. And I think one of the things Bibi wanted was some sort of progress, some sort of assurance by the U.S. that Israel might be able to go after, say, Iran's nuclear program. We don't really know what happened there. So, all the oxygen got taken out of the room by Trump talking about Gaza. So we don't really know what else happened there. But in terms of making sense of it, I'm afraid no one's really been able to make sense of it.
David, can I ask you, because you mentioned this at the very end there, the theme, which I think goes with a lot of Trump stuff, which is crazy plan obscures substance, right? While we're all paying attention to strange things in Greenland, he's taking over the federal government. But the one you pointed to is, as we sit here talking about, the Palestinian Riviera, whatever he's terming it, there is more sort of mundane progress reports that has to go on now with the peace plan, including the fact that there's only been about a dozen hostages that have been released thus far. Can you talk a bit about what the implications for the ongoing negotiations and hostage release and the ceasefire by this, right? Because he's clearly destabilized the Arab allies, Hamas, everyone who's at that table is now completely put off center. Are you concerned at all that the progress that was made at the end of the Biden administration will now stop, and the hope of getting some more of the hostages out and the continuation of phase 2 of the agreement is now in doubt?
Well, people are certainly worried about that. I mean, Hamas is not going to fail to notice that the U.S. government is now officially sort of promoting this idea. So they will be obviously very nervous. So far, it doesn't look as though it's affecting actual sort of on the ground implementation of hostage releases or any kind of slow move toward the second phase of the hostage deal. So I think my impression is that so far people here expect things to continue to progress along those lines. But we'll see. It definitely shakes things up, and in the Middle East, when you shake things up, anything can happen.
Nahal, I think Peter's point on the second phase seems to have. That was what this meeting was all supposed to be about. How do you get the second phase of the negotiations about the second phase started and moving forward? Because that's when all of the hostages, including the bodies of the hostages that are no longer alive, are supposed to be released. And it's very clear that Netanyahu never had any interest in the second phase. He wanted to continue the war. And in some ways, it seems to me Trump may have created a problem for himself because it's his ceasefire deal, and the resumption of the war is not going to be seen as a big victory, even if in the end there may be some real estate development in Gaza. So, what are you hearing in Washington about what Trump is really trying to do? Is he just throwing spaghetti against the wall, which seems to be the way he does most policymaking, or is there some bigger idea behind this?
You're just to be clear, you're thinking it's Trump's ceasefire deal. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, he has claimed it. It says I did it. If you claim credit, I mean, I'm sure that if it doesn't work out, it will be Biden's fault, because everything is Biden's fault. That seems to be the way American politics is done. Is everything good is yours and everything bad is your predecessors. But that's the way this politics is played.
I mean, Trump, absolutely will not take any responsibility if it falls apart. Neither will Netanyahu, and neither would Hamas. I mean, I think, when the Israeli far right, but also many just normal Israelis look at the situation, they are well aware that Hamas has also gone ahead and recruited some 15,000 or more people to replace the ranks of the people that they have killed. So, I mean, maybe everyone wants some hostage release, some time off from the fighting, but I don't think that many people believe that even if there is a fairly lengthy period of time where there's no real quote unquote war, that means that the conflict is over. And I mean, if you're like an Arab state right now and you're looking at the situation, I mean, my Arab sources are like, there's no way we are putting a dime into reconstruction, into rebuilding, because it's just going to get blown up again. So I think we're very much in a gray zone of what's going to happen next. But there's also this one other thing to remember. Sometimes in these places, like Yemen, for instance, ceasefires are not officially renewed, but some version of them holds at different times. And so you could see both sides unofficially taking steps that make it possible for them to both regroup, knowing that there's going to be a fight in the future. Look, is Trump serious about the 2 million? I actually think he's channeling the quiet sentiments of a lot of people who look at this situation and they think this is an intractable problem and a two-state solution is never going to work, and a one-state reality, unless people have equal rights, is never going to work. They're just, so in a way, he is just saying something that a lot of people are afraid to say because they'll automatically be accused of endorsing an international law violation, a war crime, ethnic cleansing, that sort of thing. But it's just not very practical, right? And some of the things that I was thinking of myself is like, okay, so he wants to rebuild Gaza. Who's going to do the rebuilding, right? Who's going to live there if he thinks the Palestinians have to go somewhere else? I don't see him welcoming Palestinians to the U.S., even if it's on a temporary basis. It's all just kind of noise. And I think in many ways, though, what it does do is it does help the cause of the Israeli far right, which is increasingly actually very much endorsing the removal of Palestinians from the area. The problem is it's literally a problem of physics. Like, where do you put the people, right? And that said, I will just say one other thing. It's a different situation, but under the Biden administration, you did have at least one major mass displacement of a group of people, which was in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenians who were in Azerbaijan. They were forced to leave. They had a place to go, but frankly, there wasn't that much global outcry, was there? Now, this is, again, it's a different situation, but, Trump and his people and the realities on the ground have a way of, for lack of a better phrase, moving the Overton window or whatever, and just changing the terms of the conversation. And then last thing I'll just mention is don't forget what's happening in the West Bank. Israel is increasingly taking over. Many people will say it's de facto annexing it. And there's millions of Palestinians there too.
Yeah.
I was just going to say to follow up.
Peter, I want to get to that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Peter.
I was just going to follow up on what Nahal said, because I think this physics that you got at, which is, okay, if phase one, and if they're serious about phase one, which is move 2 million people out of there, it's not just a logistics issue. There is regional stability issues here, right? The reason the Egyptians, and frankly, most of the Arab world had not engaged with the Palestinian issue pre-October 7th is because Palestinian refugees in the region have been incredibly destabilizing, right? Jordan in particular has been destabilized by waves of Palestinian migrants, Lebanon in the north as well. The Egyptians do not want tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Egypt. It would be incredibly destabilizing. And so even those who seem to be advocating this, I don't think have taken into account how destabilizing it will be for Arab allies in the region. This is not something that is going to further stabilize the situation. It's only to cause more upheaval. And if they're serious about that, because it does sound like he is going to start putting pressure on the Egyptians and others to start taking refugees, that is going to cause a whole new Pandora's box, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right on the one side. On the other side, and I think Nahal's other point is, this is pretty congruent with a long-standing agenda on the far right in Israel, which is to take over the West Bank and Gaza, and frankly empty it out of Palestinians. I mean, that was what Netanyahu tried to do at the outset of the conflict post October 7th. He went around and tried to find ways to get the Palestinians to leave so he could take out and take over Gaza. They're doing it de facto in the West Bank with the kind of attacks that are happening in Jenin and everywhere else. And we know that the government wants to annex, at least the far right in the government wants to annex the West Bank. And in some ways, this is helping and facilitating that process, but with consequences, rightly, for the region. And oh, by the way, the 5 million people, 3 million in the West Bank, 2 million in the Gaza, who have no place to go other than destabilizing other places in the region. Not a recipe for peace.
You know, is it possible Trump is thinking, if I put this proposal out there, it'll freak people out so much that maybe they will, including Palestinians, that maybe they will actually agree to some sort of a deal and a reconstruction and all these other things of the place so that we can actually keep them there? I mean, is it possible he's kind of doing it? Am I giving him too much credit, guys? Like,
way too much credit. David?
Well, it does shift. I mean, there may be intended or unintended benefits. I mean, I do think this talk may have, I think for the Israeli far right, they were quite keen to not stop the war. This has suddenly distracted them with the really big idea that they may sort of be quieter in allowing phase 2 of this agreement to take place. I think they've been pressing the government to step up activities in the West Bank, sort of saying, well, if you're going to ratchet things down in Gaza, step it up here. We want to continue to see us press the offensive. So in a way, this shakes everything up. We can only sort of guess at whether there is intentionality or a grand design behind it. But it definitely moves the Overton window. I think Nahal's right. It says things out loud that some people are thinking, but they don't really say. And so, sort of now what? But it's like with the Greenland thing, it's an outrageous idea. Behind it is this idea that there's a scramble for the resources of the Arctic for strategic control. Trump wants to increase the U.S.'s leverage in the area, so he throws this idea out there. With tariffs or Canada being the 51st state, he's using these ideas to go for some broader strategic aim. Whether they achieve that or not remains to be seen.
Well, I think it was Eisenhower who said, if you have a problem you can't solve, enlarge it. And boy, that's certainly something that Trump is learning. Whether the enlarging will actually solve the problem is a different issue.
One last thing. I think Nahal's point and Peter's point of the broader instability. Egypt. We don't know how stable that government is, and there seems to be. I know some of my colleagues are increasingly concerned about that. So, how much more noise is that going to introduce to Sisi and his government? At a time when they may be increasingly alarmed about how their own population's feeling, how their own other factions in Egypt are feeling.
Well, the same is true in Jordan, of course, and the King of Jordan will be in Washington next week, trying to emphasize that point, that the stability of the kingdom, which after all is the core of America's engagement in that part of the world, depends on not having the Israel issue spilling even further over into Jordan. So, You know, when you sometimes when you poke a hornet's nest, you get a lot of bees, and it seems to me that that's kind of part what we're seeing. One of the bees that is flying around, Nahal, and you've been doing a slew of great reporting on this, is even as we were talking about colonizing another part of the world, the agency that is particularly good at this, not at colonization, but reconstruction and rebuilding and helping democracy and economic dealing with healthcare and all the other issues that in Gaza are so needed. The one U.S. agency in the U.S. government that is really good at this is the USAID, and it's been dismantled. Within 3 weeks. 3 weeks have passed, and the U.S. government has taken over and dismantled an agency that was passed, I believe, created by an act of Congress. But that doesn't seem to be part of where we are. Just you're steeped in this story. Bring us up to date and talk about the consequences, not only for the 10,000 people who are now out of a job, but the 10,000 people did really good stuff, or very important stuff, that is no longer being done.
Yeah, I mean, look, USAID has been around since 1961. It was created by an executive order, then years later was put into law by Congress. It is an agency with more than 10,000 staff around the world. They do a lot of critical work on areas ranging from demining to, HIV, global health work, to just getting desperate, hungry people food in conflict zones, and development work, helping places build their healthcare systems, to outright infrastructure to some extent, though not as much anymore. The thing about destroying USAID that's really important and to remember is that because the U.S. is the largest funder of humanitarian aid in the world, it is probably the most important pillar that holds up the entire global aid network, right? Everybody from the United Nations to a vast number of aid organizations, big and small, get critical funding from USAID. And all of these groups coordinate all around the world to do everything, responding to crises in Sudan, responding to Gaza. I mean, everybody works together, but USAID is at the heart of this. And that includes literally just having people to call, and they coordinate. So even if there's a group that doesn't take any government funding from anywhere, and they say, look, we're going to show up and we want to help, they're, for instance, going to say, we will bring the tents, right? Because we know that this USAID funded group and this other USAID funded group are going to bring the food and they're going to bring the vehicles. So we will just bring the tents. But now, if those other groups can't exist anymore because USAID's funding is gone and they've already had to lay off staff, this has a cascade effect, then even the groups that don't get government funding are kind of like, limbs without a heart. They can't really function as well. So the entire global aid network is unraveling because of what Donald Trump, led by Elon Musk and his representatives at DOGE, this unofficial government initiative to shrink government, have been doing. We just learned, and we're just about to publish, I think it might have gone out by now, that it's actually 600 people out of 10,000 that the Trump administration has deemed essential to continuing some of the work at USAID. And it's only basically in humanitarian affairs and global health that they're going to, it seems like that is the plan for what USAID will continue to be. And it will likely be placed under the State Department, right? Instead of being an independent agency, which did have, some authorization from the State Department. But now it's very much shrinking. It's work in democracy, human rights, things like that. That appears to be going away. Now, there's a big caveat here, which is a lot of most of the people who've been put on leave they're on leave. It's on paid administrative leave. They haven't been officially fired yet. Contractors might have been, but the others have not. They are having to come back home. They're appending their lives. They have 30 days. It's a total mess. But there's lawsuits that have been filed to try to stop this, because this massive restructuring that is happening, it does not seem like it's allowable to do this without congressional approval. And they have not gotten congressional approval. And so this is something that is playing out in ways, believe it or not, that's actually even affecting farmers in Kansas, because they are the ones who are providing grain for USAID to give overseas, and they are being hit. So this is having reverberations everywhere. It's not only just a humanitarian crisis, it's also a constitutional legal crisis of what that can be done. But what's interesting, I mean, there's so many things interesting about it, is that Doge, Musk, and Trump seem to be saying, you know what? We're just going to zero it out or as close as we can, start from scratch, and we're going to dare anyone to try to rebuild or to try to stop us, right? Because people who leave, they're going to leave. They're going to find other jobs. Rebuilding is going to take a long time. People are going to die. They're already dying because of what's happening. And they don't seem to care. They just want to start from scratch. They're moving fast. They're breaking things. But it's not like just a simple app that, is about ordering, food from a restaurant or something. This is about the entire global aid network, helping the most vulnerable people in the world. And that is the system that is collapsing.
Peter, Nahal, I just want to ask Nahal a question really quickly, because you talked about the constitutional crisis, the humanitarian crisis. The one that I would mind you talking a bit more about is sort of the geopolitics of this, because interestingly, there are a lot of China hawks and Russia hawks, including, when he was a senator, Marco Rubio, who are big supporters of USAID, because particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a scramble now between the Chinese and the Wagner Group in Russia and the U.S., for sort of these soft power, efforts in the region. And there were a lot of conservative Republicans, Rubio, as I said, included, who were advocating for more funding for AID. Talk a bit about what the geopolitics, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, how this might play out.
No, this is exactly. I actually wrote a column this past week saying Trump is turning out to be a very pro-China president. And this is one of the examples. There's other examples, obviously, like tariffs on allies and things like that. But this is very much an example of where, by having USAID across places in poorer countries, the global South, America had a presence. We were there. This is important because when it comes to trade, for instance, or the private sector U.S. presence and other things, we don't have as much stuff there. And those are things that the U.S. government can't really control as much. But we could control the amount of aid and development assistance we could give some of these countries. It was a major way that we compete with China. Now, look, is China going to be able to fill in all the gaps? I don't know, but they're certainly going to try on some fronts. And again, if we're not there anymore, remember, we used to have more than 10,000 people in this agency, and now we have like 600. We're going to get crushed, right? And so people are going to have to rebuild these networks, and they're going to go with the country that offers them something. So yeah, it is it's like we're just giving a major opening to the Chinese in a lot of places around the world. And it's a very much an abdication in some ways of our soft power, which is important, by the way, in terms of preventing conflict, in terms of preventing national security threats to the United States in the long run. Everything from extremism and terrorism, preventing that from even taking root, to pandemics. So this is, maybe people right now won't feel the immediate impact in the United States, but 10 years from now, maybe sooner, we're going to notice it.
No, I think, Nahal, that just you reminded us that this was created by John F. Kennedy in 1961, and the reason he created it was exactly the point you made. It was we were in an ideological fight with the Soviet Union, who were supporting wars of liberation against colonial powers, and Kennedy recognized that you needed to fight that fight not just with hard power but with soft power, and that aid and assistance of this kind is the way you win this fight. And we've just cut off one arm. You mentioned limbless. We just literally cut off one arm of our foreign policy, with consequences that, frankly, people haven't really, aren't even thinking about, and except for those like you who are writing about it. But it certainly is not part of Elon Musk's worldview to the extent he has one. And if he does, I'm scared of it.
And I will just say, my colleague Rachel Bade wrote a really important column about how the politics of this, the domestic politics of this, actually work in favor of Trump, because there's no real U.S. constituency for foreign aid. Everybody has wild misconceptions about how much the U.S. spends on foreign aid. They think it's like 15% when it's really less than 1%. They don't really understand it. And so when people say we need to cut the budget, Americans are like, cut foreign aid. And so there's Democrats are trying to rally to save USAID, but that actually can end up hurting them with voters. And it works in favor.
Except for the farmers in Kansas. And by the way, all ships, every piece of every bag of grain that USAID sends overseas have to go on a U.S. mercantile ship. It can't go on a foreign ship, and as a result, they won't have the ability to do that. David, you're in Europe, where actually there has been a longstanding view that aid is a fundamental part of your national security strategy. Indeed, in Britain, conservatives and Labour have long believed that spending 0.7% on development aid was important. What's the reaction in Europe and in Britain to what's happening?
Well, right now I'm in Tel Aviv, but
okay.
I think it's important to put this in the context. I think Nahal's right that politically this plays well. I think it also, frankly, if European governments were to talk about cutting their aid as well, that would probably play well with their publics too. I think there's a broad disillusionment across the West at what we've gotten out of aid. I think there's a questioning. The backdrop to this, I think, is in part the feeling that we've tried to spend money in a lot of places and we haven't gotten a lot of bang for our buck. And I'm sort of curious, it feels like when I reported in Haiti in the past, it feels like Haiti kind of runs on NGO and aid money, yet you feel that year after year, decade after decade, the needle doesn't move. It doesn't make a difference. I covered many situations in Mexico where USAID was doing great work trying to help build up Mexican institutions. The kind of work that we all would love to see take root and flourish in these places. Yet it also felt that despite great work, these institutions would fail to sort of pay off in the long run. That they would still get corrupt. That they would still sort of slide back. And it's very frustrating. I think so. I just wonder how much of that backdrop informs this view. And now that they're cutting everything back, is there a way to try to save the stuff that does work? What does seem to work best? What doesn't?
Can I just quickly, some of the biggest proponents of reforming the aid sector are people who work for USAID. They will tell you, we absolutely need to reform things. Democrats, Republicans, it's a bipartisan thing. I mean, aid people are like, look, we have 13 mechanisms for hiring people. It is insane. We can't do stuff like that. This is ridiculous. And I remember when I was in Pakistan, I went to this event and it was a celebration of 70 years of the World Food Program in Pakistan. And I remember asking people, I was like, why are you guys celebrating? If you'd done your job, you wouldn't be here anymore. It was maddening. Absolutely. The dependency, the complexity. But it's reform, reform is different than destruction, right? And I think the problem people have is wait, you don't just pull everybody back. People are in clinical trials right now that are not going to be able to finish the clinical trial, because the money's been pulled. So it's not about the end goal. There's a lot of agreement on the end goal. It's about the strategy and tactics to get there.
Right. It reminds me a bit, Nahal, of the whole debate over UNRWA. UNRWA is this sort of perpetual machine to keep Palestinian refugees going. And so people then say, well, wait, what's the ultimate goal? This is just going to go on in perpetuity and taxpayer money is just going to keep doing this. So you blow it up and then you think, okay, well, what now? So I guess the search is going to be for, how much of this, what are the negative effects of blowing this up versus what you say, reforming these things, and how can the people within this aid community sort of show that reform might be better than destruction?
The one thing I'll just throw in here, before we wrap this up, is the single biggest critic of USAID for years has been Vladimir Putin. Nahal made very articulate case about why this is good for China. But, in terms of funding the civil society in Russia, even outside of Russia, news organizations, NGOs, stuff like that, Putin has been trying to kill USAID for years. And so if you need any evidence that it was having at least some effect, I think that's all you need to know.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and no, I think that's exactly right. And the other, I think, really important point to point out is the USAID is not Twitter. You can destroy Twitter and it has no impact. You destroy USAID and it has a huge impact. And to take the Twitter methodology and turn it into X doesn't mean that you can do the same thing with the U.S. government. And this is the problem. No one seems to be able to control it, and Congress can't figure out how to intervene. And that's where we're at.
And this is just the beginning. That's the thing. USAID is like a test case for the rest of the government. This is they're testing out a playbook. I mean, they're already unfolding the playbook in other parts of the government, but if the State Department, this is just the beginning.
We're living a coup d'état in a very fundamental way, and we're seeing the purges as part of that. Peter, an instrument of destruction are tariffs, and it's a very deliberate instrument of destruction. I think the USTR nominee was on Capitol Hill yesterday saying that he wants to fundamentally restructure the international trading system. How's that going?
It's a very hard question to answer. I was struck very early in the conversation when David was talking about sort of, in relation to the Gaza events, about how some of the stuff that Trump is doing may have some sort of strategic ends, even if the practicality is not there. Greenland, as David said, is there are issues of the Arctic and rare earths and stuff like that. The problem is with this latest round of tariffs, it's very hard to figure out exactly what the strategery is there, right? I mean, Canada in particular. I mean, again, just to reiterate what has happened over the course of last week: 25% tariffs proposed, announced for both Mexico and Canada, 10% on energy out of Canada, and then 10% for China. Last minute, as you said in your intro, Ivo, calls to Sheinbaum and to Trudeau. He backed down for a month, so they're still out there potentially in a month's time. Whether what he got out of Sheinbaum or Trudeau is actually substantive or not is a matter of debate. He obviously declared victory. Trudeau, what he's promised in the public is you create a border czar or a fentanyl czar, and you send troops to the border, which they already were doing, and certainly so was the Mexicans. So it is unclear whether he actually got anything out of this. But I think it gets to the bigger point about what actually, as David pointed out, what is the broader strategy here? In Mexico, I think we know, there is an issue with fentanyl that has caused problems in the U.S. Now, is that problem a Mexican problem? Is it a Chinese problem, or is it frankly just an American problem? That's an open debate. We obviously know he's got immigration issues that to play out with Mexico. The Canadian end of it, to me, has been the most bizarre and interesting part of it, because everything he says about what Canada needs to do does not really exist. There is no fentanyl really coming through the Canadian border. There is no illegal immigration really coming through the Canadian border. He seems to be trying to invent reasons to go after Canada. And the most interesting thing to me is we're right in the middle of a leadership election in Canada right now, in a general election. I know Canadian politics is not usually the topic of conversation here on your show, Ivo, but suddenly you have a really interesting Canadian election where the Conservative Party, which was way ahead in the polls, is now finding its lead becoming undermined because Justin Trudeau has become this anti-Trump hero. And it's been interesting to me to follow that from this reason, which is Trump and Musk in particular has tried to stick his fingers in democracies globally, right? David, you're in Britain, and you know very well that Musk has sort of really roiled the debate for the governing Labour Party over this issue of grooming of young girls and pedophilia in Britain, which has been an issue that has been sort of in the background for a while. It's come up to the front. We have the German Bundestag elections now that Musk has backed the AfD, and he is roiled in many ways, helping some of these populist groups. But in Canada, suddenly, it's having the opposite effect. It is benefiting the established parties, and it's be interesting to see how that plays out. From a trade perspective, what I think is interesting in this case is the markets just tanked, right? There was an understanding that this is going to have a huge impact on the U.S. economy, on global trade flows, not only energy, but almost everything that is produced in North America, thanks to NAFTA and then the renegotiated deal that Trump did in his first term. Cars and manufactured goods flow across the border pretty easily. This is going to be a huge hit for the U.S. economy, inflationary. And so I think, in some ways he looked at the markets and saw the reaction and decided to back off, which is why I think some of these tariff things will remain as threats and not really implemented.
Well, which raises the question, though, Peter, that if they're threats and they're not implemented, they lose their power.
True.
And at some point, he's got to implement them in order to retain the power.
But we've already seen people move on this. Now, of course, the Canadian and the Mexican responses have been, I would argue, sort of symbolic rather than substantive. But we saw this issue with Colombia. Remember, the Colombians weren't going to take the deportees on military planes, and then Trump threatened tariffs, and they moved. So in some ways, even though he has to implement it at some point, there has been signs that it's been effective. Just the threat has been effective, and that alone may actually get some of the things he wants to get done.
David, you know Mexico as well as anybody. It seems like Scheinbaum has played this almost from the very beginning extremely carefully and wise. She's never screamed at him. She's not going over the hill. And I think, as Peter said, for relatively little, putting some troops on the border that she was going to do anyway, she's been able to at least deflect this threat at this moment. How do the Mexicans see this as they are looking at this, and where do you think this will end up in 28 days' time?
Yeah, I mean that's a tough one. Mexico can take sort of performative steps to respond to this, but it has no capacity to actually change the underlying problem of drugs and migrants sort of going north. It can probably move the needle on migrants more by cracking down. It does. Anytime Mexico moves on the migrant issue, there is an effect. It can bottle up the South. It can make it much harder for Central Americans to come into Mexico. It can start returning people to those countries. And when Mexico sort of, Trump in the past has used tariffs to try to get Mexico to crack down on immigration, and that has moved the needle. It is a far different thing when it comes to drugs because Mexico lacks utterly the institutional capacity to deal with the drug gangs. A third of the country really is a failed state at the small s, in the sense that it is the drug gangs rather than the local authorities that hold sway. They're the ones that dictate security. They have parallel taxation systems. And so, for Mexico to fix that, you're talking about a generational problem that they're going to need 10, 20, 30 years to fix, that they have never really set out to fix in a serious way. So, I agree with Peter that when this all happened, I was turning to my colleagues and I kept saying, look, if 100,000 Americans die every year because of fentanyl coming from Mexico, I can see why the U.S. is pissed off about it. But less than 1% is coming from Canada. So why is Canada I feel sorry for Canada. I feel like they get caught up in the maw of sort of, well, you're part of NAFTA or you're part of the USMCA, so this is going to come to you too. But I sort of kept saying, poor Canada, like, what did they do to sort of...
I suspect there's a personal animosity going with Trudeau too, to be honest with you. But David, you raise another really good question, which I didn't think about, which is worth mentioning, which is the issue of the drug cartels in Mexico. Because what we're seeing from the White House now is an obsession with this, right? There is some signs, we've seen some reporting about this all Kash Patel coming to the FBI and even the Justice Department, that they want to shift a lot of the tasking from internal counterintelligence and sort of what in counterterrorism to going after the drug cartels. This is going to be a theme going forward. Again, it plays into his narrative that we are being awash with gangs in American cities, and that the country's falling apart because of it. I think David has really hit on a really important element of this, and we're going to see this repeated in other parts of Trump policy. That a lot of what U.S. foreign policy will be focused on is not things like Ukraine or even the Middle East. It is going to see a lot of resources aimed at the South, aimed at the drug gangs, whether it's warranted or not, because of what David is talking about.
But, Nahal, just to bring you in, and last point to you as we close this out, part of the drug problem, of course, is a demand problem, not just a supply problem. I mean, fentanyl would be a non-issue if people weren't, hadn't become addicted to drugs in one form or another, and had been treated in ways that dealt with the addiction. That's part of the equation, and yet, what are we doing on the demand side if all we're doing on the supply side?
Yeah, look, one thing I'm learning from this administration so far is they don't really seem to take the bigger picture into account, right? They they don't understand how pushing one side of the balloon makes the other side bigger. They're not thinking in a holistic manner whatsoever. I mean, honestly, to bring it back, if you want, fewer migrants, right, to come, maybe you shouldn't cut off USAID programs that help people live better lives where they are, right, including in Latin America. Let's just say, if you want Mexico to be able to have more resources to stop the drug trade and fentanyl and even migration, if you put tariffs on their economy, that's not going to help them. I mean, this is this is just not I wish I had a good word beyond holistic, but it's just they're not really sitting there thinking, okay. And look, for instance, one of the things they're doing, they're probably gonna designate some drug cartels as terrorist organizations, and they're gonna redirect some resources toward that. But does that mean we're gonna stop fighting other crime? And already, I mean, so all of this, it's just a very delicate balancing act. It's a shock to the system, and it's weird because under Biden, there was some understandable frustration at how incredibly cautious the Biden administration was. Right? They didn't want to take risks. They didn't want to do anything that might cause any real change on so many fronts. Not all fronts, but so many fronts. Right? And this is like a 180. It's like I just wish you could find something in the middle that is willing to take risks, but also prepared for the fallout of the risks and has some sort of backup plan. There's no backup plan.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. If Biden's caution was because of the worries and risks of secondary impact, the ignoring of secondary impact is what makes this administration as forceful and disruptive as it possibly can, and neither is likely to serve the people who, after all, government exists for. Boy. What a week. But I can guarantee you one thing. Next week, we'll have another series of really interesting stories to talk about. But for this week, I'm really grateful to Peter Spiegel of the Financial Times, soon of the Washington Post, David Luhnow of the Wall Street Journal, and Nahal Toosi of Politico for your insights. We tried to make sense of it, and we think we got all of you who are tuning in a little wiser about it, but also hopefully asking more questions as a result. Thank you all for watching and tuning in. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.